Feminism. Feminism is a term that currently carries a negative connotation, and the issue is that feminism can be interpreted in many different ways. So the question, what is feminism, is therefore not always as straightforward as it might first seem. So feminism as a theory has also often been conflated with the movements. This conflation and the difficulty in defining feminism is the reason it is commonly met with resistance or confusion. Now, in this workshop, what I'll be doing is unpacking feminism by stripping it down or back to its component parts. So when we use the term feminism, what we're doing is we're essentially making two associated judgments about our political and social reality. And the first is a belief that women should enjoy equal rights and opportunities to men. This is often referred to as the equality thesis. The second is that a degree of social change is necessary to achieve this equality. What this presupposes is that equality has therefore not already been realized, so it's currently not attained, and that some degree of social change in this context is therefore necessary to achieve this ideal. This is called the social thesis. So what do all feminist theories have in common? Now, all feminist theories subscribe to an ideal of equality, so the equality thesis, and must believe that this ideal is not currently realized in society, and that's the social thesis. And this gives rise to a political commitment to bring about social change. That is, a level of political commitment is obviously involved in the pursuit of that equality to correct the existing imbalance. Now, broadly speaking and chronologically speaking, there have been three waves of feminism so far. We are currently, some people are about to say that we are on the verge of the fourth wave, but that's yet to be seen. So in this workshop, what we'll be doing is examining each of the waves broadly and the influences behind them. Throughout this exercise, I will ask you to be mindful of the a priori position of each theory. What is their starting point? What is the way that the particular theory formulates its default reality? And this is quite important for feminist theories because it will determine the level of political commitment it demands later. So remembering that a full account of a feminist theory always encapsulates a feminist practice. Now, turning to the idea that all feminist theories have in common, equality. When feminists say they are committed to equality, what do we actually, or they actually mean? The truth is, equality means different things to different feminist theories. And it follows that the political commitment obviously will change or be different depending on the model of equality each has adopted. So there are three broad models of equality. The first model is the sameness model of equality, the second is the difference model, and the third is the dominance model. First is the sameness model, and we'll look at this in terms of the early feminist theorists. Now, this model insists on treating men and women essentially the same and are characteristic of the early feminist theories. And according to the sameness model, inequality arises by overstating the difference between the sexes, and therefore feminists should commit to a social or political commitment or political changes that affords women equal opportunities to men. So early proponents of this type of equality was the first wave feminists, they're commonly called, and the early proponents of women's rights. Thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill, who adopted the sameness model of equality. So Mary Wollstonecraft is often seen in popular culture as the pioneer of modern feminist thought. She was born in England during the end of the Enlightenment era, so she was writing at the turn of the 18th and 19th century. And this was an intellectual period which was characterized by obviously Enlightenment philosophy, which advocated the use of reason to seek out and realize the objective truths that existed out there. And this historical detail is quite important for us because it serves to explain some of the political influences behind her writings. Mary Wollstonecraft was self-educated and born into a bourgeoisie family, and she is known for writing several influential books and novels during her lifetime. She had a troubled upbringing under an abusive father and quite a weak mother, and she ended up acting as the head of the family and raising her siblings. She died whilst giving birth to the woman who would later become the famous novelist of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley. So Mary Wollstonecraft is today most commonly known for being a sort of feminist icon. However, I don't know if she would have deemed herself as such. She was a fine Enlightenment writer in her own right, and is recognized among scholars as comparable to British intellectual contemporaries of her time. So her most seminal work, the 1972 treatise, A Vindication on the Rights of Women, remains an enduring classic in philosophy today and is especially relevant for her views on women's rights. Now, in this treatise, Wollstonecraft advances her equality thesis for the sexes. She rejects the prevailing view of the time that women should be domestically educated. And by domestic education, well, as the term suggests, it means that the best education for women is to be educated at home. Wollstonecraft took issue with this view and argued that this kind of education was superficial and merely fostered in women vanity and obsession with their physical appearance. Most importantly, she believed that domestic education failed to equip women with the independence of thought, the kind of rational judgment that she saw as necessary or vital to properly equipping them to contend with a life which was a struggle. And here we see the views of life had a clearly liberal underpinning. So her default reality was that life was a struggle. And this stems from the philosophical ideals of an anthropological thought of Enlightenment thinkers around in that century, notably John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Wollstonecraft was a voracious reader and was all familiar with these political theorists. And her admiration for Locke was obviously evident in her writings. To understand where she's coming from, we can unpack the intellectual makeup or composition of her thoughts. Now, the view of reality that life is a struggle, quote unquote, nasty, brutish, and short, is derived from Thomas Hobbes in his work, The Leviathan. Now, Wollstonecraft obviously believes that life is a struggle, but does not wholesale accept the utter pessimistic despair of Hobbes. Instead, she seems to adopt Locke's view that life's chief end is survival, and that certain liberties or rights are necessary as a means to that end. Locke stated in his two treatises of government, the state of nature has law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is the law, teaches all mankind who will consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Now, Wollstonecraft, like Locke, believed that humans were not born in a vacuum. Rather, we are born naturally endowed with a God-given reason. This divinely inspired reason, she thought, in turn granted us certain basic liberties. And Wollstonecraft believed that as creatures capable of rational thought, we can be formed by our experiences or shaped. It follows that our mind can be fashioned by education. And in other words, she thought that people can be changed through education or miseducation, on the other hand. Wollstonecraft prioritizes education as a right which should be available equally to women and men. She argued that regardless of sex, the best means by which humans may contend with the vicissitudes of life is through rational education. And also to her, the ends of education was not education itself, but education will shape us to determine whether we fulfill or fail to fulfill our moral duties. So for Wollstonecraft, the political objective was to empower women, not vis-a-vis men by reference to themselves, so they could fulfill their moral duties to the best of their potential, to become good mothers and good citizens. So I don't know if she would have, been comfortable with being affiliated to the modern feminist in that sense. He writes, contending for the rights of women, my main argument is built on this simple principle, that if she be not prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of knowledge. The truth must be common to all, or it will be inefficacious with respect to its influence on general practice. She also famously wrote the line, my own sex will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone. Now, interestingly, you can see here she is quite a harsh critic of women as she is of men. So the end goal for her is not the realization of autonomy or choice in and of themselves, although they're good things as means to a specific end. So she does not seek on behalf of women the ability to choose for themselves for its own sake. Rather, she saw equal political liberties as a means by which women could lead virtuous lives. And the key to this life lay in their independent thoughts. To this author, true authenticity of woman begins with cultivating the mind. And the sameness model of equality viewed in this early sense defines equality from a broader human perspective. And Wollstonecraft, for example, seems to take the view that one's humanity is more important than one's sexuality. She refers to women explicitly as good companions to men. So she's not saying that they're secondary necessarily, but she is saying that we are complements. We are both equal companions to each other, and the end game is to be a good team player. Equal opportunity to education is thus necessary, but the universal objective is to engender good citizens, more broadly speaking, who will contribute to the common good of society. So it's important that you take your duty seriously and play your role well out in your social context. Some downsides that you might see of the sameness model is if you can imagine taking this to the extreme, so beyond these fundamental civil liberties and outside a context where each plays their role dutifully, the approach might actually result in the oppression of women. So when we overlook, and it might end up result in the overlooking of the more subtle and insidious forms of gender discrimination that lie at the second wave. Lie at the heart of the second wave of feminism. And although this model can address inequalities at this formative stage, so with regards to civil rights like equal suffrage and education, at a substantive stage when we talk about things like maternity leave, its shortcomings are exposed. For example, it's all very well to demand the same rights as men, but on a very basic level, what does this mean for biological differences which you cannot deny, such as pregnancy issues, which invariably affect men and women differently? So that's something to think about. All right. So we move on to the next wave of feminism, which is the second wave. And this wave is characteristically associated with using the difference model of equality to advance its political agenda. So this approach basically refers to an account where women's distinctive social and biological experiences are foregrounded to attain equality between the sexes. And it's based on the idea that women and men have different interests, desires, and concerns by virtue of their different standpoints, biology, and these differences should be accounted for in determining the way that people should be treated. So a useful example of this broad approach to gender equality can be found in Christine Littleton's notion of gender complements. Littleton argues that women and men occupy different but complementary cultural roles that should be given equal recognition. And for example, Littleton argues that women engaged in full-time childbearing should be afforded the same kind of financial recompense and social status as military personnel, as the roles hold similar social weight. Okay, so Simone de Beauvoir has been largely influential in the development of this model this difference model. So born in 1908 at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, she was heavily influenced by French existential thought, and her method incorporates various political and ethical dimensions. Her most seminal feminist work, The Second Sex, speaks about the inherent equality that exists in society in terms of the othering of women. So othering, she writes, stems from the relegation of women to secondary status, a sphere of immanence. She argues that women are trapped in this sphere of immanence, which is a state of passive acceptance of roles assigned to them by the society. All the while, men are characterized by assuming a position of transcendence. And this binary means that women are defined solely by reference to men. They don't have autonomy in and of themselves. They're objectified and verified. An interesting point here can be made to the influence of the German psychologist Sigmund Freud's theory on penis envy, which is largely discredited today, but was introduced at the time Simone de Beauvoir was born. And he first published this theory in 1909 in an article on the sexual theories of children. And this theory basically holds that young girls experience anxiety during puberty upon realizing they do not have a penis. And this realization goes on to manifest in competition or jealousy of the mother for attention, recognition, and affection from the father. So de Beauvoir contends that it's such theories that impose a continual inferiority upon the status of woman since their very births and by nature, and imprisons women into feminine roles like motherhood, wife, and daughter. De Beauvoir observed that women thus trapped in their feminine roles begin to act out in resentment. You remember ressentiment from last week in Postmodern Theories, but it seems to echo a bit of that. So in this resentment, women start to drag men down because they want equality. So they drag men down to the sphere of immanence. And in this period, women will use any techniques at their disposal to achieve this equality of power. Simone de Beauvoir believes that mothers, for example, will use their motherhood. Women will use sexual attractiveness vis-a-vis the opposite sex, or even manipulate the chivalry narrative. For instance, mothers might begin to oppress their sons' masculinity in order to affect their desire to emerge into the light of transcendence. So in this effort to scramble towards equality, women will start to use feminine roles to pull or drag men down. The second stage is that this will be met with resistance from the men who finally have clued on or cottoned on that women are undoubtedly double dealing here. De Beauvoir seems to see this double dealing as somewhat justified because men have enjoyed their positions of privilege for far too long, and women's roles have been denigrated as second class throughout this time. And this creates a period of mutual distrust, which leads both the sexes to become increasingly defensive of one another, clutching onto whatever powers they have by virtue of their sex. And in conclusion to a book, Simone de Beauvoir describes this quite aptly in the following terms. She says, "When women make weapons at once of her weakness and of her strength, it is not a matter of designing calculation. She seeks salvation spontaneously in a way that has been imposed on her, that of passivity, at the same time when she is actively demanding for sovereignty. And no doubt this procedure is unfair tactics, but it is dictated by the ambiguous situation assigned her. Man, however, becomes indignant when he treats her as free and independent being and then realizes that she is still a trap for him. If he gratifies and satisfies her in a posture as prey, he finds her claims to autonomy irritating. Whatever he does, he feels tricked and she feels wronged." So Beauvoir seems to hope here that this mutual distrust will eventually break and settle into a mutual respect for the differences of the other sex. So one shortcoming you might have realized throughout unpacking all this is that this approach to equality is subject to ambiguity. So it is inherently open textured in that there is doubt as to whether who is responsible for giving validity to what attributes associated with a woman. So what is validly what are valid attributes associated with a woman and what are not valid? And this inherent ambiguity gives rise to a fear that difference equality model may simply become a form of conceding that men and women are different inherently by nature, and just simply risk further exacerbating unequal treatment between the sexes, but this time under a more subtle cover. And another criticism that I have personally regarding the methodology is that it presumes that a battle between the sexes must ensue before a truce can be reached. Now, this battle will predictably be unethical, so using unfair tactics. But these unfair tactics are almost seen as justified in order to move past the impasse. The end game is a form of Hegelian equality, whereby a reciprocity of recognition is reached between the sexes. The woman is no longer seen as the other, but a truly autonomous being in her own right. Now, that's all fair and well, but in order to reach this truce, this model of feminism sees as necessary whatever means available. And is that a truly ethical process? Do the ends really justify the means? So we move on to the last model of equality, and this is the dominance model, which recognizes as fundamental the inherent power imbalance between women and men. This model believes that meaningful equality can only be achieved after examination of the nature of specific situations in which male domination occurs. To do otherwise would be to overlook the real issues. So, in other words, this feminist project, this feminist theory believes that the project should be to target social inequalities that arise in particular feminist issues. In doing so, it claims to take a more pragmatic approach to gender equality than the other two approaches. So it does focus disproportionately on the outcome. So it believes that whatever must be done to combat the power imbalance must be done, because the realistic starting point for them is an inherently imbalanced system itself. So this is often characteristic of the third wave of feminism. These third wave feminists believe in the existence of quote unquote patriarchy. So originating from the Greek term patriarchus, meaning ruling father, the patriarchy has come to mean or allude to a social system or government in which positions of dominance and privilege are primarily held by men, to the exclusion of women. If this is the default reality of the theory, so this is the a priori position, that the reality is seen as hopelessly unequal. In other words, women are playing a game which has been rigged from the beginning. And proponents of this model of equality demand a political practice that dismantles the system in its entirety. This dismantling manifests in top-down reform, like quotas, and like imposing quotas, whereby the system is changed through coercive means of correcting what is believed to be systematic discrimination. So in the 1970s and 80s, third wave feminism grew in affluence. Also known as radical feminists, this feminist theory gained scholarly prominence first, and then popular traction followed. And two notable figures leading the movement were Catherine A. MacKinnon, born in 1946, who has strongly argued for this type of approach to equality. Also associated with this theory is the work of Andrea Dawkins, who was also born in 1946 and passed away in 2005. Catherine MacKinnon is an American feminist writer and professor of law. She propounded what she coined an anti-subordination approach to feminist theory. So as the term suggests, in contrast to the first wave of classical liberal feminists, radical feminism rejects anything that an entire system that is subordinating of women. So the framework itself is hopelessly representative of male norms. The political practice that is demanded by these radical feminists is therefore not to reform or amend existing social practices. So we're not renovating the house to give equal opportunities to women. We are just mowing down the house. We're dismantling whatever has been erected. So the ending of the subordination of women and other marginalized groups, and they've allied themselves with other marginalized groups, can only be accomplished through dominance and dissemination tactics. The kind of methods aimed at deconstructing and dismantling these existing cultural norms and reclaiming ideas and lexical icons through redefinition is one of the methods, changing the meaning of words or coming up with new words. And through media tools, media platform, media control, and dissemination of information. So the end game is to completely change the social system and the cultural norms about womanhood, gender, sexuality, masculinity, motherhood, etc., etc. The dominance model is mainly concerned with achieving equality by reclaiming power. So once again, this reclaiming presupposes a reality at some point that women's power was completely lost to someone, and we now live in a quote-unquote systematically unequal social arrangement, is internally coherent and internationally rational and pervasive, yet unjust. So MacKinnon's theory thus believes that men already hold the power to decide what has value and what does not in society. Men can and do use this power, according to her, to systematically construct social realities whereby we continue to disadvantage women vis-a-vis men, and we are trapped in a position of subservience. This gender hierarchy is inherent to the system, and she sees it as self-perpetuating. She writes, men's physiology defines most sports, their needs define auto and health insurance coverage, perspectives and concerns define quality in scholarship, so it obviously had a personal impact on it. Their experiences and obsessions define marriage. Their presence defines family, their image defines God, and their genitals define sex. The dominance model in this way believes that the rectification of such fundamental equality can only be done through the reversal of dominance, and I said it's just basically leveling down the house, the enforcement of quotas, protesting and mobilizing groups, dissemination through media or social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, to redefine norms. TikTok is a big one, to redefine norms through videos, images, and words. For example, we see it manifested in the emergence of what we have come to know as launch culture, or the sexualization culture, which describes a culture which over-sexualizes women and encourages women to sexualize other women and themselves. And it has come to be unproblematically held in tandem with the resistance to the objectification of women. So at first blush, that would seem like those two ideas are fundamentally diametrically opposed, but somehow they are able to exist with no problems together. So third wave feminists, I think, would, in retort to that point that I made, would say that the rules of logic that deem these two concepts diametrically opposed are themselves a masculine construct and inherently patriarchal. So proponents of this group will not play by the rules because they believe that the game has been rigged from the start, as I said before. The rules of logic which govern political discourse is thus not neutral as it looks, as radical feminists presuppose that even those rules have been designed and created by men to dominate and subordinate women as part of this broader systematic patriarchy. So I guess after looking at all three waves of feminism, my question to you that I will leave with you is that, so do you think that you are a feminist? And what do you see as a feminist issue, or issues that require us to have theories particularly designed for women? Does feminism still have an important part to play, or role to play, in shaping our social and legal approaches to those sorts of questions that we might have? And what, in your view, are the most pressing challenges for feminism today? So I think that the broad question is, I do believe the movement still holds relevance, but what will it look like and how should it look like? And what should be its a priori or default position? And I think it's important to think once again about the importance of ontology to any philosophical theory. So thank you for joining me today for this workshop, and I hope to see you soon.